So I had to be very honest with myself about what it was that charged me every day and made me want to get up and do whatever I was doing. Any job, of course, is going to have its ups and downs. So I wanted to make sure that whatever it was I was doing was so compelling to me and important to me that I was willing to put up with whatever I had to put up with to actually do the job. And that's when the writing came in. I've always loved school. Reading and writing were like breathing to me. So I thought telling stories, whatever I have to go through to tell stories, that's what I'm going to do.
If you have ever looked around at your life and thought, this can't be it, you are in the right place. This is Flying Upstream, the podcast for people who refuse to live on autopilot. I'm your host, Kristyn Medeiros. Each week, I sit down with people who questioned the rules, challenged the expectations, and chose a different path. Not because it was easy, but because it was honest. We talk about the moments that broke them open, the decisions that scared them, and the lives they built when they stopped doing what they were told and started listening to themselves. If you are done following the crowd and ready to trust your own way forward, stay with me. Let's fly upstream. All right, free spirits, today's episode is all about women history almost forgot, or maybe the ones who refuse to be forgotten. Women who stepped outside the roles they were given, who took risks, who chose something different, even when it didn't make sense. And the truth is, those stories don't just belong in the past. They still matter right now. Today, I'm joined by Cinda Gault. She's a writer who brings these kinds of stories to life, stories about tenacious women who carve their own path, whether in the 19th century wilderness or beyond. But what makes her journey even more compelling is that she didn't start out as a writer. She worked in domestic violence shelters as a prison guard, studied criminology, became a director of social services, and then walked away from what was supposed to be her dream job to build something more meaningful. And now she tells stories that remind us what it looks like to live on your own terms. Cinda, welcome to Flying Upstream.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
So you've had a life that spans so many different worlds, from working in domestic violence shelters to being a prison guard to becoming a writer. When you look back, what feels like the thread that connects all of those chapters for you?
Well, I would say an interest in women's lives and women's stories. I mean, when I was working with victims of domestic violence, that was very much a woman's story, and just how complex and interesting women's lives are, and the courage that it takes to stand outside of what's expected of them. We seem to be very interested in doing what is expected of us. So when I have come across women in my own life and in the fictional world and in history who have decided that having a meaningful life was more important than anything that they would have to take as consequences, my ears perk up and I'm interested in their stories.
That's great. And you mentioned becoming in the past the director of social services was your dream job. And then you realized that you hated it.
Yes, I did.
So, what was that moment like when you had to admit that to yourself?
Well, it was kind of like slamming into a brick wall because I had been on a trajectory that was social sciences, social services, and following my interest. I was very interested in what I was doing, but I was very interested in the academic part, I suppose, because when I got out and got my dream job, it has less to do with the content, with the material, with the actual issues. And I found most of what I was doing was managing other people, which I found very unrewarding because I don't like it when it's my job to make other people do their jobs. It seems like being a mummy, and they were
Mhm.
not cute enough to warrant being a mummy. So I had to be very honest with myself about what it was that charged me every day and made me want to get up and do whatever I was doing. Any job, of course, is going to have its ups and downs. So I wanted to make sure that whatever it was I was doing was so compelling to me and important to me that I was willing to put up with whatever I had to put up with to actually do the job. And that's when the writing came in. I've always loved school. Reading and writing were like breathing to me. So I thought telling stories, whatever I have to go through to tell stories, that's what I'm going to do. So I completely changed because I hadn't had an education or a background in it. So I decided I would need to go back to school and learn my new tradition that would be fiction instead of writing social service essays.
Yeah, and it's so courageous that you did take that leap because a lot of people would stay in that role of their dream job just because they should, or it's good money, or it's comfortable.
Mhm.
but you didn't. You took that huge leap. And I'm curious, what gave you the final push to actually walk away and ask yourself what is meaningful enough for you to do instead, which of course was the writing, but
Well, I would say it was my level of discomfort. I mean, once you realize that you're not happy about something, uh, you have a choice. And if you have a choice, then you've got nobody to blame but yourself. If you remain unhappy, then it's you who is making you unhappy. Especially for women, that amount of freedom that women have today, the amount of autonomy they can have if they want it, the decision is really in your hands. So I just decided that this was not something that was going to make me any happier 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. And you've got one life, and how do you want to spend it? I think the hard part is when people don't admit that they're unhappy about something. That's what can keep you in a marriage, a job, whatever. When you think things are going to change, you think you're not as unhappy as you are because it relieves you of the responsibility to act. But once you accept, okay, this is not working, it's much easier. It's mechanics after that. How am I going to deal with this? It's not the angst of should I or shouldn't I?
wow, I want to just pause on what you said for a moment because it's really profound that people stay in places where they're unhappy because they can't admit it to themselves. If they did admit it, it would mean that,
You'd have to do something about it.
yeah, you would have to do something about it, which is totally spot on. And yeah, I think there's people have fear, there's social pressures, family pressures to do what other people expect of you and what they want you to do.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's a huge piece of this for sure, for sure. Now, you eventually found your way to writing, but not in a romanticized way. You had to figure out how to make a living doing it. And what did that transition really look like behind the scenes for you?
Well, what was selling at the time was romance. Category romance is a genre that was discovered and nurtured by Harlequin. And it was at the time there was lots of talk about, you two can write a romance. I'd never read one before, but now I was consuming them by the dozens to try to figure out how to do that. They're tricky little suckers to write. I have to tell you this because it's easy enough to get two people to fall in love on the first page. It's keeping them arguing for 350 pages without either one looking like an idiot that's the hard part. So you're supposed to come with 3 chapters and an outline and send that in and see if you can spark any interest with an editor. And I did several of them to get a different form letter rejection. And this was becoming very demoralizing. So I actually called a local community college where there was a course being taught how to write a romance. And I asked to have the teacher call me back. And when she did, she had been an editor at Harlequin, so she knew what she was doing. And I said to her, I have another 3-chapter and outline to send in, and I'm wondering if I could pay you to read it and tell me if I'm going to get rejected again. So she did, and she got back to me and said, "Yes, you're gonna be rejected again." And I said, "Why?" So she became a mentor of sorts for me, where she could tell me things that I didn't know, that had been done to death. That was back in the '80s when Bruce Springsteen was the thing. And she said, "Don't make a middle class hero. If you want to do an artist, make him a house painter to have a fresh take on a story." So I started from the bottom again and put together a new story. And this was my heroine was a youth bureau police officer. So you see the switched roles. And my hero owned a group home. And I set it in Guelph because I was told at the time that Americans find Canadian locales exotic. So the thing that they argued about was child rearing. So she had a kid that she had to put in a group home. His was the only bed in town that was open, and so she had to place him there, even though she knew she disagreed with his way of bringing up kids. So that they had something meaty to argue about for 350 pages because they both had good points. And then there was a sort of a personal backstory in there as well. So that became my first novel. And it was very exciting because under her tutelage, I was able to successfully get it published. And it sold really well, went all around the world in different languages, that sort of thing. So it was a very gratifying early success. Now, I also had to work part time to be able to support myself because it's very difficult to make a living as a writer. But I didn't mind that because I was doing what I wanted to do.
And I know that one of your earlier works was republished decades later, even though
Yeah,
you originally wrote it on a manual typewriter.
yeah.
What did that experience show you about storytelling and what actually stands the test of time?
Yeah, that was the story that I am telling you about that had its time, and then I got my rights reverted to me, and my current publisher said that she would like to, republish it 37 years later. And you're right, I did on a typewriter, so there was no electronic copy of it for me to be able to submit to my current publisher. But the process of revising something that you wrote 37 years ago, it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, there were landlines and phone booths and tape recorders, and so it was a completely different world, unimaginable to me at the time of what, technology could become. So I had to change all that, but what I didn't have to change was the actual love story, which I found quite reassuring that, people are still people and we fall in love now like we always have, and that part of the story could stay intact.
I appreciate that people still fall in love the same way that they always have. And our technology may change, the world around us may change, but deep down at our core, we're still people who want to fall in love and have that romantic experience. That's so beautiful.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
There is a human condition. We are a certain thing, and we're very inventive in the technology part of it. And I understand that technology and dating don't really mix very well from the stories that I
Mhm.
hear, but, all our propensities to hope and dream and, all the things that we want, we always wanted. We just have more options now as to how to get them.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And now your work focuses a lot on historical fiction centered on women breaking convention.
Yes.
What draws you specifically to those kinds of stories?
Well, they are people I admire, that can actually be driven from the inside out rather than governed from the outside in. That these women who I have both invented and discovered were willing to pay whatever price they needed to pay to have a meaningful life. And they had meaningful lives. So it's the story becomes intriguing to watch how they did it and watch kind of in real time as you live it through with them, how they accomplished what they did for themselves. And it was for themselves. They weren't going out there and trying to save the world. They were going out there to do their responsibility to themselves, which was to have a meaningful life. And I say meaningful rather than happy because life isn't always happy. You can cope with unhappiness if you feel that what you're doing is truly meaningful to you. It's like, you have a child. Bringing up a child is really difficult, but there's really nothing more rewarding than that. So the meaning was what I saw them driving for. And it's out of my respect and admiration for that kind of a story that's the world I want to live in. And you do live in a story when you're writing one. I was out there paddling with them as they were paddling and riding horses while they were riding horses. And that's the world that I really like to live in.
It's beautiful. I appreciate that you are living it with them, because your stories often highlight women who refuse the roles that they're given, much like your own story. And whether that's, being the farmer's wife or settling into a sensible life, do you see parallels between those women and women today?
Yes, women's lives have always been very complicated, of course, because of reproduction. That's what the complication was. And now, because women have autonomy over when they have kids, if they have kids, I see that there is a lot of confusion about how do you fit in a full-time occupation, that you want to have as a woman. You want to have an intellectual life, you want to have an actual life that's your life without having to sacrifice the experience of having children. And it is a very complicated road now. I had two sons and they each had two daughters who are now just coming up to 3 years old. So they made me a grandmother of, I tell them, I have twins, you each have one, I have twins, because they're only 3.5 months apart. So when I have them, it's toddler chaos. But, I watch as women try to be mothers and professionals, and that's a very tricky thing, I find it. I did it differently because I have had and have again my intellectual life, and the whole time I was bringing up my kids, I was going to school with them as I went back to school. But it was very important for me to have the experience of bringing up my kids, and it was really difficult to do all of that. I felt like My husband and I were doing 5 full-time jobs between the 2 of us. But, you know, the happiness that comes from that is also unparalleled in anything else. But yes, those kinds of pushes and pulls are here today in women figuring out what they want and how they're going to manage that.
I mean, your comment that how complex it is for women to not wanna sacrifice their professional life or their passion and still have children and be an awesome mom.
Mhm.
Gosh, I have to think that probably goes back to cavemen days, like, that is something that will be here forever. It is so
Yeah,
difficult.
except that back in caveman days, the idea of woman having a profession or to having some work she did outside the home was unheard of. So we have, you know, in these times, I mean, there are good and bad things to that because it's very difficult to have, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, the equivalent of full-time jobs to do that, that it goes 24 hours a day, all that sort of thing. But there is the possibility now of trying to figure that out where until fairly recently in history, those options were not open to women.
That's a good point, and I know you've actually written about the 1970s in your book, Everything I Hope For.
Mhm.
I'm curious what it was about that era that felt important or compelling for you to explore.
Well, I lived through it, and I came of age in the '70s, so this is probably the most autobiographic in spirit book that I will ever write. So that decade was important to me because I experienced history. It was a very different way of writing a book than the first 2 that I learned. The first one, This God-Forsaken Place, I wrote set in 1885, and then the second one, A Small Compass, was set in 1806. So I learned about those worlds through research. And it was a very intellectual experience in that sense that I was stitching together worlds that I didn't know about, and I had to go and find information that would, you know, tell me what it smelled like and what it felt like and what, you know, all of those things that you need to breathe into a story as a writer. But in the 1970s, apparently it's historical fiction because if you set at least half of your story 50 years ago or more, it's considered historical. So unfortunately, I'm walking talking historical here. But those times were very tumultuous. They were important times because of the complexity, sort of the modern complexity in women's lives. In Canada, the Divorce Act changed in 1968, and apparently a lot of women wanted out of their marriages at the time. So the divorce rate soared through the 1970s. So you had a lot of domestic disruption during that time as women were trying to find their feet about what they owed their families, what they owed themselves, what they were willing to put up with, what they weren't willing to put up with. So they were very exciting times for women, but there was also a lot of sadness and disruption among the kids who were involved in all the divorces and all that kind of confusion. So, but people come of age in all kinds of different circumstances. So my protagonist did at that time, and she chose the actual fate worse than death as far as everyone was concerned, which was the long-haired hippie with no job. That was the and what decision she's going to make for herself. So that kind of a story could have turned into all kinds of different stories. I mean, it could have been the Romeo and Juliet true love crushed story, which it is not. It could have been a kind of a naturalist story where it they're kind of stuck and there's nothing they can do about it. And it isn't that kind of a story either. It's her going out and you live with her in real time, watching how she makes decisions, how she suffers for the bad ones, and how she's rewarded for the good ones, and how she figures out how she's going to have her meaningful life.
Incredible. Incredible. Well, Cindy, this has been an incredible conversation, and we are winding down a bit. I've got one last question for you. For someone who's listening right now who feels that quiet pull toward a life that looks different, if they could borrow just a fraction of the courage from the women that you write about, what would you want them to do next?
I would want them to be honest with themselves. I think everything arises from that, that if you are brutally honest with yourself, you can decide what you're willing to suffer for and what you're not. More recently in my life, I decided that I was going to retire teaching because my 2 granddaughters were born. And I thought, in my list of priorities, what's most important to me? Well, this would allow me to become a full-time writer, which is very important to me, and a good grandmother. And both of those ended up being more important than grading another 1,000 student essays. And that was 3 years ago, and I am a meaningful grandmother to both of those little girls. I adore them, and I get to do things like this now that I couldn't have done if I had been teaching. So, if you take the leap and you aren't honest with yourself about what's important to you, you're gonna land somewhere that is worth whatever you have to go through to get there.
Such wise words. Cinda, this was such a powerful conversation. I really want to thank you for being here. The stories remind us that the desire to break free, to choose something different, to live more fully, it's always been there, especially for women. And the question is, my free spirits, what are you going to do with it? Cinda, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story with us today.
Thank you.
If today's conversation sparked something in you, take a moment to sit with it. You can find more episodes and resources at flyingupstreampodcast.com. And if this show speaks to you, the best way to support it is to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who is ready to question the path they are on. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and always keep flying upstream.